In this video I want to talk about what's called the Euthyphro dilemma, and this is on pages in the textbook, in the book you have, 11, 12, up until the top of page 14. Okay, so looking here at the bottom of page 11, we see this definition that's offered of pious, offered by Euthyphro. I would certainly say that the pious is what all the gods love, and the opposite, what all the gods hate, is impious. Okay, so Euthyphro says that in the bottom of page 11, and then at the top of page 12, Socrates points out, or explains, that this can mean either of two things. One, the pious is loved by the gods because it is pious, and two, the pious is pious because it is loved by the gods. Okay, so Socrates asked that question there, but it breaks down to these two options. Okay, so we have this, and you can think of pious in this context here as moral or morally correct actions. So then the first one means something like morally correct actions are loved by the gods because they are moral. And the second one is morally correct actions are morally correct because they are loved by the gods. Okay, so now the tricky part. What's the difference between these two options? Pause the video for a second and look at the two options closely and see if you can tell what each one means. And yes, they are different. They mean different things, so see what you can do with them. The idea for the first one is that we have these actions that are moral. What makes them moral? Well, who knows? We haven't done a section on ethics this semester in Intro to Philosophy. If you're watching this in a different semester and we did do some ethics, or if you have taken the intro course to ethics, then you know that the morally correct action might be the one that either maximizes happiness, or the morally correct action might be the one that can be universalized, and here I'm referring to the categorical imperative. Or it could be the action that respects rights, maybe the human rights of others. So there are competing answers to what makes an action morally correct, and if you haven't taken any ethics, then don't worry about it. The only point that we need is that there is something that makes certain actions moral and others immoral. Okay, so then back to option one. Pious is loved by the gods because it is pious. So there are certain things that are moral. And these things are loved by the gods because they are moral. Okay, great. But the important point here is that God, or the gods, don't have any role in making these things moral. There are some things that are moral for whatever reason, and the gods love these things. So this option is saying that whether something is morally correct or incorrect is independent of God, or the gods. Alright, now the second option. Something is pious or moral because it is loved by the gods. Here the idea is that God does make certain things morally correct. The way I sometimes think about it is that we have all of these potential actions: lying, telling the truth, stealing, not stealing, murdering, helping people in need, and so forth. And before God gets around to it, none of these actions are morally correct or morally incorrect. They're all just morally neutral. So then God's like, I need to make some stuff morally correct. So he randomly picks some actions to be morally correct and others to be morally incorrect. And so basically to do that, he has to flip a coin for each one, and then he's done. But notice, in this scenario that we're thinking about, there can't be a reason why an action is designated as morally correct instead of morally incorrect. If there is a reason why one should be morally correct, then we're back to option one. Okay, so option 2 is saying that what's morally correct or morally incorrect is basically random. And that's not really considered to be a satisfying alternative, and so for our two options, the first one seems to be the one we want. Okay, so that's all just a little bit of background on 10A. They're at the top of page 12. Now let's look at page 13. Starting at 10D, until the end of the page, Socrates speaks 7 times. So let's take a look at what he says. First, Socrates says, "What then do we say about the pious, Euthyphro? Surely that it is being loved by all the gods, according to what you say." Okay, so that's just restating our starting point, what Euthyphro said back on page 11 at 9E. Now, for the second time that Socrates speaks, is it being loved because it is pious or for some other reason? Then next, Socrates again, "It is being loved then because it is pious, but it is not pious because it is loved." Okay, so that's Socrates confirming the first of our options and dismissing the second one. Then Socrates says, "And yet it is something loved and God loved because it is being loved by the gods." Okay, so there we get the idea that anything that the gods love is, as Socrates calls it, God loved. But the pious and the God loved are different. Now, skipping down to the 6th time that Socrates speaks, "We agree that the pious is being loved for this reason, that it is pious, but it is not pious because it is being loved." Euthyphro agrees. Okay, that's what I talked about earlier when we were looking at the previous page. And then at the end of this page, Socrates says, "The God loved, on the other hand, is so because it is being loved by the gods, by the very fact that it is being loved." Alright, so Socrates has come to the conclusion that the first option is the only viable option, and according to that option, being pious is independent of the gods. As he says at the top of the next page, and here I'm looking at 11b on page 14. "I'm afraid, Euthyphro, that when you were asked what piety is, you did not wish to make its nature clear to me." Socrates, being the guy he is, says, "But you told me an affect or quality of it, that the pious has the quality of being loved by all the gods, but you have not yet told me what the pious is." Okay, and then after bickering a little more on this page, they examine another possible definition for pious, but I'm going to end this here.